Petra, welcome. It is lovely to see you. We met each other 2 years ago in Washington, D.C. But since then, we have been in contact and exchange. So I'm so happy to have you today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being part of my Diversity Talks project. As you know, the purpose of my project is to create certain level of awareness and exchange. And so I'm so looking forward to have your opinion input in that regard as well. First, let me introduce you, Petra de Bruxelles, diversity and inclusion advisor at IMF, International Monetary Fund, based in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
But before IMF, you worked at European Investment Bank as senior diversity and inclusion officer as well. So you are such an expert working in this field for years to create diverse and inclusive environments in international institutions. So my first question to you is, what's your definition of diversity, and why is creating equal, diverse, inclusive environments important, necessary?
Well, thank you, Oya. It's a pleasure to be talking with you. I always enjoy our conversations, and I'm thrilled to be part of this series of talks that you're having. If I could just say before we get started that whilst I'll be talking about the IMF, I do have to emphasize that these are the views that I'm expressing are mine. They are not those of the IMF. It's the executive directors of the IMF or the IMF management. So although I'm talking about what I do professionally, they are my personal views. So what is my definition of diversity? Well, I mean, diversity is the mix, what I call the mix of individual characteristics, either those that you can visibly see, so physical, or they can also be non-visual characteristics. So when people think about diversity, they normally automatically think about things like gender, race, even disability, nationality in the context of international organizations, but it also can be things like experiences, educational background, professional background, ways of thinking, skills, competencies. All of these actually, to me, are the broader diversity description. And I think it's important to have a diverse workforce because each individual brings in their differences, and those differences, so long as they are respected, so long as they are taken into consideration, which is where the inclusion part comes in, then they can actually contribute to making a much more creative, a much more innovative environment. And it's that combination of all of these differences that actually enrich discussions, enrich decision making, and like I said before, creativity and innovation.
Yeah. Can I ask you one more thing in that regard? As I said earlier, you are such an expert, so you have been working in that field for years. So what do you think? What has changed, if any, in the last 10, 15 years? Or what hasn't changed in terms of diversity or inclusion?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly we've seen, that we're getting more women in senior positions. We're getting more women on boards. I think that there are some areas where there's still a lot of improvement to be made. Diversity and inclusion and equity to me it's a journey, and it's a long journey. And although we've been speaking about it for decades, it advances quite slowly, to be honest with you. So I think that some of the things that we still need to pay attention to, and this came to the fore earlier this year, is race. I think that in many countries that has not been on the agenda. And whilst, in many countries there's legislation around needing to make sure that there is representation of different groups of the population, etc., I think that the racial equality part throughout society really has not been addressed. And that is, it's a historical thing. It goes many centuries. It's not something new, but I think that that has been overlooked, and I think that rightfully, the time has come for that to be addressed.
Mhm.
Another area that I think is lacking, or where we can do better generally, is the inclusion of people with disabilities. They are also a very marginalized community, and I think that the importance of their contributions to society has been largely overlooked. And that's one thing that I worked on when I was at the European Investment Bank, very, very closely with communities. And I'm hoping to do the same again at the IMF. So
Mm.
they're the two areas I think where we really need to push
Yes.
more.
Okay. And Petra, could you please tell us more about your role at IMF? I'm curious to know, is your role limited to, create diverse and inclusive environments within the structure of IMF, or do you promote diversity, inclusion, equality to the countries that IMF has an economic relationship?
Mm. Well, personally, Oya, my role is the internally focused diversity and inclusion and equity. But that said, the IMF does have a gender diversity advisory group, which focuses on gender equality and women's empowerment in our what we call in our operations. So there are sort of different entities within the IMF that concentrate on the internal, which is myself, and the external. That being said, we do collaborate quite closely, and sometimes in articles of it that are being published, for example, we will actually show the two sides of one coin. What is the IMF doing internally? What is the IMF doing towards the membership in terms of gender equality, for example? We are looking now, as I said, with race, we have had calls for maybe setting up a similar advisory group on racial equality. But we need to see whether that is going to happen in sort of, the immediate, given the crisis, given COVID, given the amount of work that the fund has at the moment. Of course, it would be, I think, a big ask to say, let's launch something new. But I know that our colleagues are very conscious of it. And even the MD has made calls to say that, when we build back economies, it has to be done in an equitable and inclusive manner. So,
Mhm, mhm, mhm. And what, in times of crisis, especially in times of the COVID-19, by the way, I think what we are experiencing right now is quite different than our previous experiences with crisis. But I have noticed that, or maybe our lessons from previous crises, specifically the one in 2008, in times of crisis, diversity and inclusion can easily get impacted and neglected within the organizations. So, Petra, what do you think? What is it which has not been well established, structured, or internalized? What happens in times of crisis?
Well, yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think that it depends on the level of maturity in terms of diversity and inclusion that any organization or company is at. We know that in times of crisis, the softer things in companies tends to suffer, be it training, be it diversity and inclusion. If budgets need to be reallocated, they're the types of things that automatically they say, well, these are nice to haves, they're not absolute needs or necessity. With diversity and inclusion, I would argue it is an absolute necessity. But again, it depends on the maturity of the organization and where they are on their D&I, diversity and inclusion journey. And I think that, for those who were struggling even before a crisis to embed diversity and inclusion, it'll be even more challenging during a crisis because business priorities change. People's attention is on different things. It's in responding to the crisis. In the context of the current one, COVID, it's all about, well, how do we make sure that that our staff or our employees are okay? If we're having to lay off, what is the best thing that we can do? How can we best treat our employees? And so there are always different priorities. But I think that what really, really matters is the engagement of the leaders of an organization or a company.
Mhm.
And so those that have very strong leadership in terms of diversity and inclusion and strong support and engagement of the leadership will probably fare better when crises hit. And diversity and inclusion actually will be seen as an asset at those times,
Mm.
because it's precisely in times of crisis when you need to come up with new ways of doing things, innovative solutions for either your customers, or in our case in international organizations for our membership.
Mhm.
And that's where diversity really, really then really comes to the fore, and that's where you can leverage diversity.
Mhm.
So it's around where are you at the time on your diversity
Mm.
journey, and what support and engagement do you have from the leadership? Because if you are well advanced, if you have that support, chances are you won't forget about diversity and inclusion. And in fact, it will be an integral part of your solution to whatever the crisis is.
Mm. Mhm. And Petra, what do you think? What is your opinion? Do you think diversity, inclusion mentality comes from is it a top-down thing? Okay, it comes from the management. Okay, let's create a more diverse and inclusive environments where exchange happens, or in today's world, it's a bottom-up thing. This is our real, or is it both?
Oh, yeah, it has to be both. You need that support from the top management, because they're the ones at the end of the day that say, allocate resources. Okay.
Mm.
So you need that support, you need that engagement, you need them to be vocal so that people within the organization and outside the organization actually see that commitment. But it has to be true commitment. You do have some leaders who say the right things but don't act internally in a way that is commensurate with what they're saying externally. And so you need that leadership for sure. But at the end of the day, what is going to make things happen, what is going to change the culture, if a culture change is needed, what is going to embed D&I in the organization is a more bottoms up approach. At the end of the day, it's the middle managers who take all the people decisions, unless it's for a senior appointment. But if you're talking about, your general employee population, it's middle managers who take the decisions on hiring, on promotions, on career development, etc. And so you need really also engagement from that perspective. And also, to be honest with you, from employees themselves. I've always said inclusion is everybody's responsibility.
Mhm.
It's not just the responsibility of managers, it's everybody's responsibility.
Mm.
So when you're having a team meeting, if you notice that somebody is not being included, as a staff member, you should say, oh, so I see so and so hasn't, or I notice so and so hasn't had an opportunity to speak.
Mm.
Do you have anything to say? And involve people in that way. And I think it has to come from everybody.
Mm.
And when we talk about diversity, of course, the people who have the diverse characteristics. So I'll take an example: that people
Please.
with disabilities, they're in the best place to tell you what they need in terms of any adjustments or work environment, or where their challenges are. They are the people best placed to tell you and to even suggest solutions. So
Mm.
it is for everybody. And
Mm.
everybody has to get involved if you truly want to change and you truly want to have
Mhm.
an inclusive and an enabling environment.
Mhm. Mhm. And could you please tell us then, what do you do, okay, as diversity and inclusion advisor at IMF? What has been done in times of crisis in this
Mhm.
pandemic? And
Mm.
we would be pleased if you can share maybe some good examples with us.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, what I do, I embed and I foster I work with managers, I work with staff groups to make sure that we offer an inclusive environment. Like I said, it's a journey. We're not perfect, and I would never say we are. I also work with all of the HR divisions or areas of HR, talent management, talent acquisition, even our benefits and compensation colleagues, to make sure that D&I is embedded in everything that we do and every possible HR initiative. And that's sort of really the core of what I do. But to respond to the question in terms of what we've done in the context of the crisis that we're in at the moment, we have actually done quite a lot. And I have to say, I was really encouraged when, at the beginning of the crisis, after about 3 or 4 weeks of working from home, managers actually started to reach out and said, Petra, I'm very concerned. All of my team are working remotely. I'm only seeing them through video. We have these meetings. How do I make sure that I'm being inclusive? It was a challenge when we were all sitting in the office together, but now it's an even bigger challenge because we only see each other when we have meetings. What can I do? So one of the first things we did is we produced some guidelines for managers, but also for employees
Yes.
on how to work remotely in an inclusive way, how to have inclusive meetings, etc. So that was one of the very first things we did. But more than that, on the policy side, we're an international organization. Most of our staff actually come from other countries. So we're headquartered in Washington, D.C., but the majority of our staff have come from their home countries and moved to DC. So of course, a lot of concern for them around their families in their home countries, whether they could travel or not. And of course, as travel got more and more restrictive, quite a lot of concern for employees around, how they could manage working remotely, but also, take care of their families. So we changed the rules or not changed. We temporarily adapted our policies with regards to working remotely from outside what we call the duty station, which is where your home office base is. So it could be Washington, but we do have colleagues who are, around the world, so that if they needed to go home to perhaps take care of elderly parents or parents, or they just felt better being in their home country, they could actually work for a longer period of time from their home country. We expanded what we call family leave. So we have a certain number of days a year that employees can use to take care of sick dependents, be it children, be it parents, whoever a dependent happens to be. And normally that's limited to a certain number of days. We extended the number of days that they could use. We also made the use of leave more flexible. So, for example, we normally have to use a certain number of days of leave, and this is with well-intentioned. It's from the perspective of we want people to go and rest. We want them to take a break from work. So we sort of have a number of days that you're meant to use a year. We actually had to abandon that because the work of the fund went up so much that it was not possible for people to use their leave in the early stages of the virus and the pandemic. So we said, well, we're getting rid this year of the minimum usage requirement. All of these sorts of things, and we also put in place. We have what we call a communities of practice for managers, and we focused some of those on what our colleague managers were doing to foster an inclusive work environment while working remotely. And we actually had them relate their own stories about good practices, but also the challenges that they were having, so that our managers felt like they weren't alone. Their colleagues are having similar challenges. Let's talk. Let's see how we can work this out. Let's figure out solutions together, so that they also built themselves, as we call it, a community of practice
And let's
and
learn
shared
from
their
each other as
experiences.
well.
Yeah.
Tourism.
And some of those we did bring in external people to sort of guide the conversation and make proposals. But it's mainly, again, it's a grassroots management level sort of initiative to get them to. So, like I said, they don't feel like perhaps they're as alone as they feel they are.
Mhm.
So those are just some of the things that we've done.
Mhm. So I see that, maybe as a starting point, you listen to your employees' needs and challenges when you face with this crisis or what needs to be done. And then you have started designing maybe new working styles and focus on
Yes,
what is required. Uh,
absolutely, and that is what being a truly inclusive environment is, and it's absolutely critical in times of crisis to do that, because it's like I said, with the example that I gave of people with disabilities, they're the ones that know what they need. Now, that being said, of course, you can't always cater for every situation. You can't cater for every need that the different staff members have. One of the challenges that we've had is, what do we do about parents who are also having to have their children at home with virtual education? They are really, really stretched, because they're basically, having to be there to educate their children, or at least manage the education of their children, which normally would be left to schools and teachers, and also being at home in the same environment and having to work, and those challenges of that 24-hour a day presence on both fronts, the home front as well as your home now being also your office, has been a challenge for many, and it's still something that we know that some staff or some employees are still being challenged with, and we're looking at how we can better help them. But of course, sometimes it does take time to figure out. We need to also see, what the schools are doing, for example, in the Washington, D.C. area, which covers not just D.C., but also the neighboring states of Maryland and Virginia. And they're all doing slightly different things. So, that has been a real challenge for us.
Yeah, I can imagine. But what we have done so far is great. And Petra, I don't know what you're thinking, but for me, maybe the number one rule is to create diverse and inclusive environment is to be mindful that, we all are different. Okay. We all are different as human beings, and therefore we may have different expectations. So rather than, let me put it in that way, creating or offering equal conditions is different than creating or offering same conditions. Okay, what I need from the organization may be different than what you need from the organization.
Absolutely, Aya, and I mean, that's why I talk about equitable. There's equality, which we talk about when we think about things like pay gap. There needs to be equality. But when you're talking about policies within HR and around diversity and inclusion, what really you need to be looking at is equitable and what is fair most of the time. I mean, perhaps not, you like I said, with pay, with remuneration, you need to make sure that it is equitable and that people, it is equal. But there is that nuance between equality and equity, or equitable treatment. And I think that that's something you asked earlier on, what are maybe some things that have been overlooked. I think that difference also is something that is starting to come out a lot more, and has been coming out a lot more in terms of the D&I field of not just study but practice. I think that equitable part is coming out more and more, and has been so for probably the last sort of 5 years particularly.
That's great. Thank you so much. I mean, it's always lovely talking to you, but I have got one more question. It's my last question. If you were Oya, what last question would you ask Petra de Bruxelles?
Wow. That's quite a challenging one, and I'm not sure that I would have one last question. Um, but thinking about it, I think a key question that we're probably all struggling with, so it's not necessarily directed at me, but just generally, is what happens when it's time for us all to return to the office? I don't know about in Europe. I know I've been reading and hearing that lockdowns are coming back due to the second wave. Well, at the IMF, hardly anybody has gone back to the office. Only key personnel who need to be there for certain things have been allowed to go to the office, and it looks like it will be, you know, at least January 2021 before any of us really get the opportunity to go back. So what do we do when we go back? When most likely we know that I think the dynamics of where we work and how we work have changed, I hope, forever. And to be honest, I see COVID as a blessing from that perspective, because in organizations where you had a culture of having to be present, I think it's really helped change the perspective that staff or employees can only perform if they're in an office. I think that has changed. So that's a positive coming out of. But then now what happens when we go back, and most likely we've shifted how we work and where we work. And most likely we will be in environments where we have, let's say, up to 50% of people or employees in the office and 50% out of the office. And how do you manage that? How do you make sure that you are still managing in an inclusive way, that employees have equitable access to key assignments, for example, that evaluation of performance doesn't suffer. And I think this is going to be a big challenge, and I know it's something we're working on at the moment within the IMF, to see how we prepare for that and how we roll it out, knowing that I think that what used to be considered normal is not going to return, but none of us know what the new normal looks like.
These are amazing questions. Have you started reflecting or not thinking about the answers to those questions?
Well, like I said, we have, we're at the beginning of it, but clearly, and to be honest, we already had the desire to change from being primarily office-based to a more hybrid. So this has helped us in that journey. But there's so much to consider. And obviously, training of both managers and employees is going to be key. Guidance to both of them is going to be key. But I also think that setting expectations is going to be vital. I think that, whilst companies and organizations really want to offer as much flexibility as possible, and that will be a shift for most organizations. I think employees also need to recognize that they do have responsibilities and they do have duties to the organization. So it can't be a one-way street. If we're being flexible and saying you can work from home if you like, 5 days out of the week, and maybe in any month, up to 25 days, or no, so 20 days is the average working. There may be times when you have to give that up because of business priorities, because we need you in the office to participate in a particular initiative, in a particular meeting, etc. And you have to also, as an employee, have that flexibility and accept that flexibility, that maybe at short notice you will be called to come to the office, and that is a responsibility that you have towards the organization. So we need to be careful that it's not just a one-way street. It's got to go in both directions, and the flexibility has to be on both sides.
But I see that crises are our chances to discover another way of doing things. Okay? There isn't one way of doing things. There may be different ways of doing things, and
Absolutely.
the crisis offer this chance to us.
Yeah.
Petra, thank you so much for your time, for your input, and hope to see you in person soon in Europe or in the States.
Oh yeah, that would be wonderful. And thank you again so much for the opportunity. It's been as usual, a pleasure to speak with you. And indeed, I hope we can meet soon.
Yeah,
These travel restrictions are really, really difficult for all of us. So
yeah, it is.
thank you
Stay
again, Oya.
safe. Thank you. Thank you.